How far would you go to test your family's love? George Thompson, a self-made billionaire, sat at the head of a long, polished table, his fingers tapping nervously on the wood. The room was filled with the luxurious scent of steak and fresh wine, but his mind was elsewhere. It was his annual family dinner, and for years, George had been questioning if his children truly cared for him or if they were just interested in his money. This year, he decided to put them to the test. He had faked a debilitating illness, slumping in his chair, feigning weakness, and groaning in discomfort. His eyes, however, were sharp, watching his children's every move. Sarah, his oldest, a brilliant doctor, sat across from him, her focus on her phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. Alex, his middle child, played with his phone, absent-mindedly checking his email. Mia, the youngest, sat quietly, sipping her wine, a look of concern flashing across her face as she glanced at her father. George put on a weak smile, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "I'm feeling terrible today, my health is failing me, and I don't know how much longer I can keep up with all of this." His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, the room went silent. Everyone stopped what they were doing and turned their attention to him. He could hear the faint clink of glasses as his children tried to process what he had just said. The tension in the room was palpable. George watched as Sarah finally put down her phone and looked at him with concern. But it was the kind of concern that felt practiced, the kind that said, "I'll be the good daughter, but I don't really want to be bothered." "Dad, maybe you should see a doctor," Sarah said, not getting up from her seat. "You need to rest." George could feel the sting of her response. Was this really how she felt? Was this all he was worth to her? He needed to know. He needed to test her. "I can't rest, Sarah. I need you here with me. I need my daughter to care for me," George said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah froze, looking at him for a second, then glanced at her phone again. "I can't, Dad. I have a shift at the hospital tomorrow." She said it almost too quickly, like she was trying to avoid any further confrontation. George's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he shifted his gaze to Alex, hoping for a different reaction. Alex, ever the one to avoid confrontation, didn't meet his father's eyes. He fidgeted in his seat and then shrugged. "I've got a big meeting at work. I don't know if I can take time off, Dad." George could feel the coldness creeping up inside him. Was this the family he had worked so hard to provide for? He looked at Mia, the youngest, who had been quiet up until now. She seemed torn, but her face was unreadable. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it guilt? Was it concern? Was she really the only one who cared? "Mia, come home. I need you," George said, his voice pleading now. But Mia shook her head slowly. "I can't, Dad. I'm in the middle of finals. I can't just drop everything." George felt his chest tighten, the realization dawning that none of his children were willing to drop everything for him. None of them were willing to step up. Not even for their father. The silence in the room was deafening. It was clear now George's test had failed. But he wasn't ready to give up just yet. He wasn't ready to accept the truth. Not without a fight. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, as George watched his children avoid his gaze. His heart sank with each word that went unsaid, and the weight of the years he had spent building his empire felt heavier than ever. The house was quiet except for the sound of a clock ticking, a reminder of time passing by and slipping through his fingers. George took a deep breath and looked around at his children. They were all successful in their own right, but none of them had ever truly needed him the way he had hoped. The tension in the room was unbearable, and George's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. But just as he was about to speak again, something unexpected happened. Mia, the youngest, who had been silent for most of the evening, suddenly stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, and all eyes turned to her. For a moment, George thought she might just walk out, like the others had done, but instead, she walked over to him. She stood in front of him, her eyes locking with his. "Dad," she said, her voice steady but soft. "You've never asked any of us for anything real. We've always been part of your plan, but never part of your life." George felt a pang in his chest, but before he could respond, Mia continued. "You're not sick, and we all know it. But maybe it's time for you to see what really matters. You can't keep testing us like this and expect us to love you more because of it." The words hit George like a slap in the face, but in that moment, something shifted inside of him. He had always wanted his children to prove their love for him, but he had never once truly tried to understand them, to ask them about their lives or dreams. It had always been about him and his wealth, his business, his legacy. George looked down at his hands, feeling the years of hard work and success now seem hollow. I didn't know," he murmured, barely above a whisper. Mia shook her head, a mixture of frustration and sadness in her eyes. "Of course, you didn't. You were too busy making money to see your children." She turned to walk away, but stopped halfway. "We love you, Dad. But it's not about the money. It never was." George sat in stunned silence, his mind struggling to comprehend the weight of her words. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt before, the sting of realization. He had spent so much time focused on building his empire that he had neglected the very people he had hoped to leave it all to. The man who had always been in control, who had made billions and built an empire from the ground up, now found himself unsure of how to repair the fractured relationships with the people he loved most. The moment was heavy, a turning point in his life, and George knew that things would never be the same. As Mia walked out of the room, George looked at his other children. They had all been silently watching, and now, each of them seemed to be processing the moment in their own way. His eyes landed on Sarah, who had been staring out the window, her expression unreadable. "I know I've been hard on you," George said, his voice raw with emotion. "I didn't mean to push you away." Sarah turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, there was no anger, no frustration. Just a quiet understanding. "You've always pushed us away, Dad. But we're still here." The words hung in the air, and George realized that perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't too late to change. Maybe he could finally give his children what they needed all along, his time, his attention, and his love. The wealth and the empire could wait. But the love of his children? That was something George had to fight for, something worth far more than anything he had ever built. George sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The weight of Mia's words, and Sarah's quiet understanding, was still heavy on his heart. He had spent so many years building something he thought would define his life, yet it was clear now that the things that truly mattered were the people in his life, not the wealth or the empire. The house was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, George allowed himself to truly feel the emptiness that had been there for so long. He had pushed his children away, thinking that success and money would earn him their love and respect. But the truth was, it had done the opposite. As he stared at his children, who were now looking at him with a mixture of concern and confusion, George knew that he had to make a choice. He could continue down the path of self-doubt, surrounded by the hollow walls of his empire, or he could finally choose to reconnect with the people who mattered most. He stood up, feeling the weight of his decision pressing on him. "I've been selfish," George finally said, his voice rough. "I've spent so much time focused on everything else that I forgot what really matters. I've forgotten you." There was a long pause before Alex spoke. "It's not too late, Dad," he said softly. "We are here. We've always been here, even when you didn't see us." George felt a lump in his throat. He had always tried to be the strong, successful man, the one who never showed weakness. But now, as he stood in front of his children, he realized that showing vulnerability was the first step toward repairing what had been broken. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I want to be a better father, a better person. I want to be here for you." For the first time in years, George allowed himself to feel the warmth of his children's presence. They had been right all along. It wasn't about the money. It was about love, connection, and understanding. Mia walked over to him and placed her hand on his arm. "We can't fix everything overnight," she said gently, "but we can start now. We're a family, and we'll always be here." George nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. "You deserve more." Sarah stepped forward, offering him a small smile. "We don't need more, Dad. We just need you." George stood there, surrounded by his children, and for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be a father. It wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about being there, showing up, and making the effort to love and understand. It was about time. Time that he had wasted, but time that he was now determined to make the most of. As he looked around the room, he felt a sense of peace settling over him. He wasn't alone anymore. His family was there, and that was all he needed. The past could not be changed, but the future was still his to shape. And for the first time in a long time, George felt ready to do just that. The following weeks were filled with a sense of change that George had never experienced before. The mansion, once so cold and silent, now felt warmer, filled with the subtle sounds of laughter, conversation, and even disagreements, signs of life that George had almost forgotten existed in his own home. He began spending more time with his children, listening to them, really listening, and the transformation was undeniable. Sarah, who had once kept her distance, now invited him to her hospital for rounds, showing him what it truly meant to care for others. Alex, the ever-busy middle child, started opening up about his frustrations with his job, and George found himself offering advice that was no longer driven by ego, but by genuine concern for his son's happiness. And Mia, always the quiet one, seemed to blossom with each passing day, sharing her dreams of working in a non-profit to help underprivileged children. George had once thought he could buy everything, including love, but he now realized that the true wealth he had been searching for wasn't in his bank account, it was in the moments spent with his children, the love he could give them, and the trust they could rebuild together. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, George looked at each of them. The tension that had once filled the room was now gone, replaced with a sense of peace. "I don't know what I've done to deserve this," George said, his voice full of emotion. "But I'm thankful." Sarah smiled softly, a warmth in her eyes that George had never seen before. "You're doing just fine, Dad," she replied. "You've been here, and that's what matters." Alex nodded, his usual sarcasm replaced with sincerity. "It's good to have you back, Dad," he said. Mia, sitting quietly, finally spoke up. "It's never too late, you know. We've all been waiting for you to see us, not just as part of your world, but as your family." The words hit George harder than he expected. He had spent so much time chasing success, but now, in the quiet of the evening, surrounded by his children, he felt like the richest man alive. The road to redemption hadn't been easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but George knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone anymore. His family was back in his life, and that was all he needed to be truly happy. As the evening wore on, they all laughed, talked, and shared stories. It was simple, just a family coming together, but it felt like everything George had ever wanted. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to do, but for the first time in years, George felt that perhaps he had found something worth more than any business deal or luxury car: the love of his children, unspoken, but evident in every word, every gesture, every smile they shared. George stood in the doorway of the living room, watching his children interact. It was a simple Sunday morning, no business meetings, no deadlines, just a rare, peaceful moment. The house, which had once echoed with the hollow sounds of business calls and silent meals, now felt alive. Sarah was laughing at something Alex had said, while Mia, quietly sipping her coffee, added her own thoughts to the conversation. The warmth in the room was undeniable, and for the first time in a long while, George felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He had learned the hard way that success and money were only part of life's equation. The real value was in the time spent with the people you loved. It had taken him years to realize that, but now, he could finally see the truth in his children's eyes, the love they had always offered, even when he had been too blind to accept it. As the days passed, George became more involved in their lives. He attended Sarah's hospital shifts, sitting quietly in the corner while she worked, offering support without words. He listened to Alex's frustrations about his job, and for once, George didn't try to fix everything with money or connections. Instead, he gave him the gift of understanding. Mia, who had always been the quiet one, began to open up more. They started talking about her dreams, her passion for teaching underprivileged children, and her desire to make a difference in the world. For the first time in years, George didn't feel like he was missing out on anything. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, and he was seeing his children for who they truly were. One evening, as they gathered for dinner, George looked around the table at his children. It was a simple meal, nothing extravagant, but it felt like a celebration. He smiled as he took in the sight of them, each one different, yet each one so much like him in their own unique way. "I've spent so much time building things," George said, his voice soft, "but now I see what really matters." Sarah, who had been quiet until then, reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "We've always been here, Dad. You don't have to build anything to make us proud." Alex nodded, his usual sarcasm replaced with sincerity. "It's not about the money or the empire, Dad. It's about being there for each other." George felt a lump in his throat. He had spent so many years believing that success and money were the most important things in life. But now, surrounded by his children, he understood that the true success was in the relationships he had built. "I know," he whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Mia, who had been quiet until then, spoke softly. "It's okay, Dad. We're just glad you're here now." The words were simple, but they meant everything. George realized that he didn't need to be perfect or have all the answers. He just needed to be there, to show up for his children, to be the father they needed. And in that moment, as the laughter and conversation continued around him, George knew that his wealth, his empire, could never compare to the wealth of love and connection he had now found in his family. It had taken him a long time to get there, but he was finally home. George sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The warm evening breeze seemed to carry a sense of calm, one that George hadn't known for years. The house was quieter than usual, but in a good way. There were no business calls, no urgent meetings, just peace. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly present in his own life. His children had given him something money couldn't buy, the opportunity to be part of their world, to understand their struggles and their dreams. And that was more valuable than anything he had ever built. He thought about the countless nights he had spent in his office, the long hours, the endless work, and the deals that kept him away from the people who needed him most. It was easy to get lost in the pursuit of success, but now, standing on the other side, George realized how much he had missed. Sarah had opened up to him in a way she never had before. He knew her world was demanding, but he had never truly understood the weight of her responsibilities as a doctor until now. He had seen her tireless efforts to save lives, to put others before herself, and it had changed how he saw her. She wasn't just his daughter. She was a woman, strong and capable, who had chosen a path of service and sacrifice. And it made George proud in a way he could never have imagined. Alex, too, had surprised him. His son had always been a bit of a mystery, wrapped up in his own world of ambition and career. But lately, Alex had started to open up about his own doubts and frustrations. George had always assumed that Alex's career was a reflection of his need for validation, but now he saw that his son was searching for something deeper. Alex didn't want just success, he wanted fulfillment, and that realization made George admire him even more. Mia, his quietest child, had come into her own as well. She had always been the one to stay in the background, not seeking attention, but George had seen her passion for helping others grow. Her dream of starting a non-profit had started to take shape, and he could see how much it meant to her. She wasn't just dreaming, she was taking action, and that filled him with pride. The bond between them had grown in ways George hadn't expected, and it was more profound than any business partnership he had ever forged. Over the next few months, George took the time to nurture his relationship with each of them. He learned more about their lives, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. He became involved in their daily routines, asking questions, offering support, and simply being there when they needed him. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. The simple act of showing up, of making the effort, changed everything. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, George looked at his children and felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. They had taught him something he could never have learned in any boardroom or meeting room, that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the love and connection shared with the people who matter most. Sarah, Alex, and Mia had become more than just his children. They were his partners in life, his teachers, his guides. And for the first time in a long time, George felt complete. He knew that the journey ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready. Together, they had rebuilt something far more important than any business deal. They had rebuilt their family, and that was a legacy worth more than all the riches in the world. Months passed, and George's relationship with his children only deepened. The changes he had made in his life didn't happen overnight, but they were real. Every weekend, George and his children would meet, not for business, but for simple meals, walks in the park, and heartfelt conversations. He'd learned to put his phone away, to focus on the moment, to listen more than he spoke. Sarah, once the distant and reserved daughter, had invited him to join her at the hospital one evening. He wasn't there for any particular reason, just to watch her work. He saw her in action, calm, precise, confident. She wasn't just saving lives, she was making a difference. George had never truly understood the weight of her profession until that night. When they had a quiet moment together, he spoke softly, "I never understood the pressure you carry. I'm proud of you." Sarah smiled, her usual stern demeanor softening. "It's not easy, Dad. But I've learned to live with it." His heart swelled with pride. He had always been proud of his children's accomplishments, but now, it was different. Alex, too, had begun to find his own balance. He had started volunteering for causes he believed in, using his skills to help others. George watched as his son's walls came down, bit by bit, and the hard exterior he had built to protect himself started to crack. One afternoon, while sitting in the living room, Alex turned to him and said, "Dad, I've been thinking a lot lately. Maybe it's not just about the next big deal. I'm working on something that feels more meaningful." George listened intently, realizing how much Alex had grown. Mia, the youngest, had always been the quiet one, but now her voice was heard more and more. She had started working part-time at a local community center, helping children who were struggling. George had attended a few of her sessions, watching from the back as she patiently helped the kids with their studies. He was in awe of her patience and compassion. One evening, after a long day of work, Mia sat down with him. "Dad, I know you want to help me, but this is something I need to do on my own. I want to create something meaningful." She was determined, and George admired that. His children had become so much more than just his family. They were individuals, each on their own path, each with their own dreams, and he was no longer just a bystander. He was part of their journey. And it felt like the most important role he had ever played. As time went on, George's business began to take a backseat. His empire, while still growing, no longer consumed his every waking moment. He made an effort to show up for every birthday, every school event, and even just casual get-togethers. His children had taught him that the moments he had once taken for granted, simple moments of togetherness, were the most valuable. The house, once cold and quiet, was now filled with life, with conversation, with laughter. And George knew that the best investment he could make wasn't in stocks or real estate, but in his family. One evening, as they all sat down for dinner, George looked around at his children, at Sarah, Alex, and Mia, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had given him something he could never repay, but he was determined to try. "I can't thank you enough for showing me what really matters," George said quietly. "You've changed my life." Sarah, smiling softly, replied, "We just needed you to see us, Dad." And in that moment, George realized that everything he had ever needed had been right in front of him all along. His family. Their love. The time they shared. And that was more than enough. The legacy he had once focused so heavily on building wasn't a collection of assets or achievements, it was the bond he shared with the people who mattered most. His children. His family. And that was more than he had ever hoped for. It had been a year since George had begun making real changes in his life. The house that once stood as a monument to his success now felt like a home. The walls no longer echoed with the sounds of business calls and silent meals. Instead, they were filled with laughter, conversation, and warmth. He had reconnected with his children, each one growing into their own, discovering their passions and pursuing their dreams. George had learned that success wasn't measured by the size of his empire, but by the love and respect he earned from the people who mattered most. Sarah, Alex, and Mia were thriving, and George couldn't help but feel immense pride in the people they had become. Sarah had recently been promoted to head of her department at the hospital, a milestone she had worked tirelessly for. But now, when she spoke about her work, there was a sense of fulfillment in her voice that George had never heard before. It wasn't just about being the best. It was about making a difference. Alex, too, had found his calling. His career had taken an unexpected turn when he decided to start his own business, a social enterprise focused on sustainability. George had watched with admiration as Alex threw himself into something that wasn't just about profits, but about creating positive change. And Mia, the quiet one, had found her voice in a way that was nothing short of inspiring. She had launched her non-profit, focused on providing educational resources to underprivileged children, and was already making a tangible impact in the community. George had never imagined that his children would lead such fulfilling lives, and it filled him with a sense of joy he hadn't known was possible. The more time he spent with them, the more he realized how little he had truly understood them before. They weren't just his children, they were individuals with their own dreams, aspirations, and strengths. And he was fortunate enough to be a part of their journey. One evening, as they sat together, the family shared a quiet dinner, enjoying each other's company without the pressures of the outside world. George looked around the table at his children, each one so different, yet so much like him in their own unique ways. He felt a deep sense of gratitude. "I can't tell you how proud I am of each of you," George said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You've all found your own paths, and you're making a real difference in the world." Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with a sense of purpose. "We've always had the support we needed, Dad. It's just that we needed you to see us, really see us." Alex, who had grown so much in the past year, added, "You're the reason we've become who we are, Dad. It's your example that taught us the importance of doing what we love, not just what's expected." Mia, sitting quietly, spoke for the first time that evening. "You've taught us that success isn't just about what we achieve, it's about the people we help along the way. And that's the greatest legacy we could have." George felt a lump in his throat as he looked at them. The pride he felt was overwhelming, but it was also humbling. "I've spent so much of my life chasing the wrong things," George admitted, "but now, I realize that what I have with all of you is everything I ever needed." The family fell into a comfortable silence, each person reflecting on the journey they had been on together. For George, it was a reminder that family, love, and connection were the true measure of a life well lived. In the years to come, he knew that these moments, these connections with his children, would be the foundation of everything he had worked for. And he was more than ready to build the rest of his life on that solid ground. As the months went by, George found himself in a new rhythm, one that revolved around the family he had once taken for granted. He no longer had the pressure of constantly proving himself in the business world. His priorities had shifted. His mornings were no longer consumed with meetings or calls. Instead, he spent his time taking walks with Sarah, who would share stories of her patients and the challenges she faced at the hospital. Alex often came over after work to discuss his latest project, excited about the progress he was making with his social enterprise. Mia had become a regular visitor, too, telling George about the children she was helping and the small but meaningful changes she was making in their lives. She had even started to bring some of the kids from her non-profit over for dinner, allowing George to see firsthand the impact her work was having. The house was always full of conversation, laughter, and ideas. It was a far cry from the silence that had once defined it. George realized how much he had missed these moments, how much he had underestimated the importance of spending time with his family. One evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Sarah brought up an idea that had been on her mind. "Dad," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking about opening a clinic. A place that's not just for the wealthy, but for people who can't afford quality healthcare." George listened intently, impressed by the vision his daughter had. "That's a big step," he said. "But I think it's a great idea. You've always been the one to care about people, not just medicine." Sarah smiled, grateful for his support. Alex, who had been quiet, spoke up next. "I've been thinking about expanding my business," he said. "But instead of just focusing on profit, I want to incorporate more sustainable practices. I want to give back to the environment, not just take from it." George was proud of his son, who had shifted his focus from making money to making a difference. "That sounds like a great plan," George said. "You've always had a good heart, Alex. I'm sure you'll make it work." Then Mia, who had been listening quietly, added, "I've been considering starting an after-school program for kids who don't have a safe place to go after school. I think it would be a great way to provide them with opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have." George couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride in his children. They were all thinking beyond themselves, focused on giving back to the community, and using their talents and resources to make a difference. "You've all come so far," George said, his voice full of emotion. "I'm proud of each of you. And I want to help you with whatever you need." His children exchanged glances, and Sarah spoke up. "Dad, we've learned so much from you. Not just about business, but about what it means to truly care for others." "I agree," Alex added. "You've shown us that success isn't just about what you have, but about what you give." Mia smiled softly. "And you've shown us that it's never too late to change, to be better." George felt a lump in his throat. "I wish I had learned this sooner," he said, his voice shaky. "But I'm glad I'm learning it now. And I'm proud of the people you've become." The conversation drifted to other topics, but George sat back, taking in the scene. His family was thriving, each person pursuing their passions and making a difference in their own way. And for the first time in years, George knew that this was the true legacy he would leave behind: his children, the people they had become, and the love they shared. He had spent so much of his life trying to build an empire, but now, he realized that his true wealth was in the relationships he had cultivated, the love he had earned, and the family he had finally come to appreciate. It had been a long journey, but George knew he was finally on the right path. And this time, he wasn't walking alone. As the year came to a close, George found himself reflecting on everything that had changed. The holidays were approaching, and for the first time in a long time, his family was preparing to spend them together. It wasn't just the grand meals or the gifts that filled George with a sense of fulfillment. It was the simple act of being surrounded by the people he loved, knowing that they had all worked together to build something far more important than wealth. The family had come together in ways George hadn't expected. They had supported each other through challenges, celebrated each other's successes, and, most importantly, they had forgiven the past. He was no longer the same man who had focused solely on his empire. He had become a father, a friend, and a partner in a way he hadn't been before. As they gathered around the table for Christmas dinner, the laughter and conversation filled the air, and George couldn't help but smile. His children were happy, and that was all that mattered. Sarah had finished her plans to open the community clinic, and she had started working on the foundation for it, a true testament to her heart for helping others. Alex had begun to see the fruits of his efforts in sustainability, and his business was slowly making an impact, not just financially, but in the lives of the people who were benefiting from his eco-friendly practices. Mia's non-profit had flourished as well, providing educational resources to children who otherwise would not have had access to them. Each of them was following their passion, and George couldn't have been prouder. As they exchanged gifts, George realized that the most meaningful thing he could give his children was not something wrapped in a box, but the promise that he would always be there. There was no price tag on the love and support they had for each other. It wasn't about the money or the material possessions, it was about the shared moments, the time they spent together, and the bond they had formed. "I've learned so much from all of you," George said, his voice full of emotion. "You've taught me that the real gift is being present, being here with each other, and showing up when it matters most." His children smiled, the warmth in their eyes, reflecting the journey they had all been on together. Sarah, Alex, and Mia had all grown so much over the past year, and George had, too. He had learned that life wasn't about perfection, and it wasn't about what you could accumulate. It was about the people who stood by you, the love you shared, and the moments you created. As the evening wore on, George found himself reflecting on how much richer his life had become. He had spent so much time chasing success, but in the end, the most valuable thing he had was the family around him. And for the first time, he knew that he had truly found what he had been searching for all along. The journey had been long, but it had brought him home, and for that, George was more grateful than he had ever been for anything else. He wasn't just a man with an empire. He was a father, a mentor, and a man with a family he loved and who loved him in return. And that was enough. As spring arrived, George found himself settling into a routine he had never imagined for himself. The business world that once dominated his every thought now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. His children, now adults, had found their own paths, but they had kept him close. Sarah's clinic was steadily growing, offering healthcare to those who couldn't afford it. She had become a beacon of hope in their community, and George often volunteered his time there, helping with the administrative side. Alex, having expanded his sustainable business, was now working with major corporations to help them reduce their carbon footprints. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about making a real difference. Mia had made incredible strides with her non-profit, and now, with a dedicated team, she was working on expanding the program to multiple cities. The impact she was making was tangible, and George couldn't have been prouder of the woman she had become. It wasn't just about what they were doing, it was the fact that they had all found purpose in their lives. George often sat in his study, watching the sun set, thinking back on the years he had spent chasing success. He had missed so much. But now, he was making up for lost time. He found joy in the small things, the moments shared with his children, the laughter, and the conversations about everything and nothing. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, George looked around the table at his children. The house was full of light and warmth, a far cry from the cold, sterile mansion it once was. It was now a home, filled with memories that could never be bought or sold. "I'm proud of you all," George said, his voice filled with emotion. "Not just for what you've achieved, but for who you've become. You've all found your own way, and I couldn't be more grateful." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes bright. "We couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You taught us more than you'll ever know." Alex nodded, his usual confidence replaced with sincerity. "You've shown us what it really means to care, to give back, and to be part of something bigger than ourselves." Mia, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "It's not about what we have, but what we give. And that's what you've taught us." George felt a lump in his throat. He had spent so much of his life thinking he had to build an empire, but now, he understood that the real legacy he would leave behind wasn't in his wealth or achievements. It was in the lives of his children, the impact they were making, and the love they shared. He had learned that success wasn't about being at the top, it was about making a difference, no matter how small. As the evening continued, George sat back, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. He was no longer the man who had lived for business. He was a father, a mentor, and a man who had found purpose in the people he loved. It wasn't about the past anymore, it was about the future they would create together. And for the first time in his life, George knew that he had everything he needed. His family was his greatest achievement, and that was enough. As the seasons changed, so did the dynamics within George's family. What had once felt like a long road to redemption now seemed like the start of something even more beautiful. Every day felt like a new opportunity to grow, to connect, and to build memories together. George no longer felt the weight of guilt or regret that had once haunted him. He had embraced the changes in his life and had come to understand the true meaning of family. Sarah, Alex, and Mia had all become not just his children, but but his closest friends, and he cherished the moments he spent with them more than anything else. One weekend, George joined Sarah at the clinic she had founded. It was a small building, but the work they were doing there was monumental. Sarah introduced him to the staff, who welcomed him with smiles, and to the patients whose lives had been touched by her dedication. Watching her in action, George realized just how far she had come. She had turned her passion for medicine into something that not only healed physical wounds but also provided hope to those who needed it most. "I never thought I'd see this," George said, his voice filled with awe. "You've built something incredible here, Sarah." She smiled, looking at him with a mix of gratitude and love. "I couldn't have done it without your support, Dad. You taught me that it's not just about being successful, but about using that success to help others." Alex had continued to work on his business, but with a newfound focus on sustainability. His company was gaining recognition, not just for its innovative products, but for its commitment to the environment. One evening, as they were having dinner, Alex shared exciting news. "I just signed a partnership deal with a major retailer to help them go green," he said, his eyes shining with pride. "This is exactly what I wanted, to make a difference, not just in business, but in the world." George couldn't help but smile, feeling proud of how far his son had come. "That's amazing, Alex. You're doing exactly what you were meant to do." Mia, too, had made incredible strides. Her non-profit was expanding, and she had begun mentoring other young people who shared her passion for giving back. George had visited her at work one afternoon, where she was teaching a group of children. He watched as she patiently guided them through their lessons, her compassion evident in every word. "I'm so proud of you, Mia," George said quietly, as he stood in the back of the room. "You're changing lives." Mia turned to him, her smile warm. "I learned from the best, Dad." In that moment, George knew that his children had become not only successful in their own right but had also embraced the values he had once overlooked. They had learned that success was not about what you gained but what you gave. They were each building lives filled with purpose, and George was honored to be part of that journey. Life was no longer about the wealth or power he had once pursued so relentlessly. It was about the love and connections he had forged with the people who mattered most to him. And as the years continued to pass, George found peace in knowing that the legacy he would leave behind wasn't in his bank account or the buildings he had constructed. It was in the hearts of his children, who would continue to make a difference in the world, and in the love they shared as a family. As time passed, the changes George had made in his life became more evident. His family was thriving, and the bond they shared had never been stronger. He no longer measured success by the size of his bank account or the deals he closed. The real measure of his life's success was in the happiness of his children, the work they were doing in the world, and the love they had for each other. Sarah, now the head of her community clinic, continued to inspire others with her selflessness. She had recently been invited to speak at a health conference, where she shared her vision for making healthcare accessible to everyone, regardless of their income. Her words were powerful, and George was in the audience, beaming with pride. He couldn't have imagined a more fulfilling life for his daughter. Alex, too, was growing in ways George hadn't anticipated. His sustainable business had expanded to new regions, and his focus on creating eco-friendly products had not only benefited the environment but had also given him a sense of purpose he had never felt before. His company was now collaborating with schools to teach children about the importance of sustainability, and George saw the passion in Alex's eyes when he spoke about his work. It was clear that his son had found his calling. Mia had become a role model for the younger generation. Her non-profit had grown significantly, providing educational resources to underprivileged children. She had recently been featured in a local news segment, and George watched with admiration as Mia spoke about the importance of education and community involvement. It was incredible to see how far she had come, from the quiet young woman she once was to a confident leader who was making a real difference. George knew that his children had not only learned from him, but they had also surpassed him in many ways. They had taken his lessons about hard work and success and turned them into something meaningful. They had all found their purpose, and it filled him with a sense of fulfillment he could never have imagined. One evening, As they all gathered in the living room, George looked around at his children, each one so different, yet so alike in their values. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, and George felt a deep sense of contentment. His family had become his greatest accomplishment, and he couldn't have been prouder. "I've spent so many years focused on building something for myself," George said, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "But what I've built here, with all of you, is so much more important. You are my legacy." Sarah, Alex, and Mia smiled at him, their eyes full of love. "We've learned so much from you, Dad," Sarah said. "Not just about business, but about what it means to care about people." Alex nodded. "You taught us that success is not just about what we achieve, but about the impact we have on others." Mia, who had been quiet for a moment, spoke up. "And you showed us that it's never too late to change, to become the person we're meant to be." George smiled, feeling the weight of their words. It had taken him years to learn the lessons that had now become the foundation of his life. And as he looked around at his children, he knew that this was just the beginning. There were still many challenges ahead, but George felt ready to face them. He had found his true purpose, and it was in the love and support of his family. His legacy was no longer about wealth or status. It was about the people he had helped shape, the lives they were touching, and the bond they shared. And for the first time, George realized that he had everything he needed. He wasn't just a man who had built an empire. He was a father, a mentor, and a man who had finally found peace with who he was. And that was more than enough.